Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is a video discussing the 2016 DC Reboot. So yes, recently DC Comics announced that in June, following issue 52 of most new 52 titles, they will be returning back to issue number 1s and shifting the focus in the comics to a new direction to make them closer to the relevant movie universe. And while the details at the moment are fairly sparse, it's a good opportunity to discuss the merits and the greater role of reboots in the comic world of superheroes in general. And look, let's get this out of the way. I'm not one of those fans who thinks that continuity is the most important thing in the world. I also don't think that stories of the past are the absolute best necessarily, or somehow sacrosanct and can't be touched. Change is important, and I recognize that. I'm more than willing to accept shifts in the continuity if, and this is a big if, it is done for creative purposes or to gain something out of the story. But, quite simply, there's absolutely no way this is being done for creative reasons as opposed to for what it is, a shallow corporate mandate exclusively interested in the bottom line of Warner Bros. Even then, I'm not totally against the idea of making the comics closer to the movies. I get it. It helps getting the movie-going audience more engaged in the comics by making them more accessible. There's not much wrong with that. I kinda understand the need for it, especially nowadays with all the comic book movies and the huge popularity of them. You'd want to have some degree of accessibility. However, there's something that's been bothering me about all of this for some time. Since I first talked about this reboot in my review of Batman number 48, I've entered into a bit of a downward spiral of annoyance. What at first was just a mildly amusing case of DC desperately trying to keep up with Marvel has dissolved into feelings of being tired with the current state of DC Comics as a whole. This is a company that I do like from certain perspectives, even now. The climate within the business and the way they treat their staff and fans is, as far as I can tell, largely a positive one, especially compared to their history. But these reboots are making any sense of emotional investment I might have with this company kind of irrelevant. Why is this? I mean, Marvel did the same thing and I just don't feel the same way. Hell, I went so far as to sort of defend their reboot when I was talking about it during Secret Wars. And then it hit me. While superficially Marvel and DC are doing similar things, Marvel treats their reboots very differently than DC, and the difference is critically important. You may be surprised to know that while DC regularly jettisons stories that are out of date or just embarrassing, Marvel has never really opted for this approach. Yes, it has done many reboots over the years, if you can call them that, but I usually think of those as the sort of soft reboots, where the continuity remains but the content goes in a new direction. Very rarely are stories actually discarded in Marvel. For example, after Secret Wars, the Fantastic Four are no longer active, but their stories are still there. All that stuff with Galactus, the Inhumans, the Future Foundation, I'm pretty sure it all still happened. It's just that Reed and Sue aren't active in the superhero community in the present day. DC, on the other hand, has outright ditched so many of their stories, or worse, the consequences of these stories. Over in Marvel, important characters like Gwen Stacy, Karen Page, and Captain Marvel remain dead, because those stories were important and formative for the characters relevant to their stories. And while Marvel isn't perfect, DC is way worse with their tally. Jason Todd is alive and well. Barbara Gordon is Batgirl again, and apparently Stephanie Brown and Cassandra Cain never became Batgirl as we know them. The Tower of Babel, World War III, 52, none of these stories that I really like necessarily have happened anymore. It's all gone, while in Marvel's sliding timeline, everything good and bad from giant-sized X-Men to the Civil War are all still in continuity, just over a relativistic time period. So Gwen Stacy did die, and pretty much in the same way that we've seen in the original story, but it happened a few years ago instead of a few decades ago. What matters is not when it happened or how it happened, but that fact that it still happened. So when Peter Parker goes a little crazy over Norman Osborn taking over S.H.I.E.L.D. 3 full decades later, you understand why. You know why Peter takes Norman so seriously and why it's such a big deal for him, because it's kind of a big deal for us. And that difference is more important than ever. Because while Marvel gets to benefit from years and years worth of story and rich history, even now after perpetually resetting to number 1 titles over and over again, especially in the last few years, DC doesn't go for this. Marvel literally at this point has a full world of cool ideas that the writers can draw from, while DC has to largely start fresh. Meaning that the same stories have to be retold in order to get this sense of legacy back, only it usually ends up worse and the original impact and memories are long gone. We saw this in the most recent story arc with The Flash featuring Eobard Thawne. They tried to reintroduce this character and the ideas behind him, only to kind of fart out a story that just wasn't as balanced or as polished as the original tale. You can't top the classic stories because they kind of exist in this weird nostalgic place in our memories. And even then, if you somehow make it better, there's very little reason to try this unless there's a real need for modernization. Even if you need to modernize something, it should be trying to introduce something new or different, to challenge your fans or offer them something they haven't seen before. Rarely do either of the comic book companies actually do this. Now don't get me wrong, things aren't so black and white. Marvel does make mistakes like these all the time. For example, I'm not really sure how this Civil War II business is going to go, but even something like that, do you see the important difference here? There's a little 2 at the end of the title. This isn't a story to replace the original Civil War, although I could see the merit of that, but instead it's a sequel to it. A new story with a similar theme but an entirely different plot. Likewise, last year we had Secret Wars. But it wasn't so much a remake, but rather a sort of pseudo-sequel. The point is, it's its own story. They aren't telling the same story over again, but are instead marking new territory, using the original Secret Wars as an inspiration with light references to it. That was a far better option over trying to make the same story over again. And yes, Marvel also does modern takes on their classic stories, or creates an alternate universe to tell stories in a new way. But they've never really gone full tilt with rebooting their main universe completely. Broadly, although not always, it seems to me that DC tries to replace old stories and erase its past mistakes, while Marvel tends to recreate new stories and reconcile past mistakes. And that's a big difference. It's not always the case for either company, but overall, that's how I divide these two up and how they treat continuity. And that difference is not minor. I no longer have any emotional investment in these new 52 monstrosities compared to Marvel. Many of these stories and characters feel like parodies of the original stuff I know and love. Jokes in and of themselves. And when I finally do get to a story I enjoy, like Robin War or Batman Endgame, I am left with these bitter feelings, because I know in DC's world it can't and won't really matter. You have this cool story that could change the direction of Batman comics, like in Robin War or again Endgame, and instead, once again, it can't and it won't. It is, for a lack of better term, pointless. In a story like Robin War or Batman Super Heavy, which rely heavily on continuity, it shouldn't surprise anybody that continuity ends up mattering the most. When it comes to the current state of DC Comics, it kind of breaks things for stories like Robin War at its core, and does so in a way that's so devastating I find I'm questioning the entire direction of the company as a whole. In fact, Robin War was a big formative moment for me. It was a good story and one that I enjoyed, but it kind of shatters this illusion hiding a much larger problem hanging over the entire company. It shows the entire point of the New 52 and whatever they're going to call the new reboot is actually one that's kind of unhealthy and a very poor decision on behalf of DC. I'm left broken and stymied about what to do when covering future DC stories, and just annoyed at the whole situation. For example, if we're to do an origins bio on any DC character now, we're going to have like 2 or 3 continuities to pick out at the minimum, and that's going to be really hard to determine a cohesive origin story for a character. I'm worried this will be bad for DC and bad for us. The New 52 has always been controversial, and while it annoyed me, I don't think I realized just how bad it is for the comic book fans in comparison to Marvel's approach to reboots until I started writing this. As much as I hate the all-new, all-different, super special, awesome, buy our comics today or else Marvel .1, they've never really gone this far. Even disastrous stories like One More Day or Decimation never threw out their entire history of the preceding comics. And now I get why. This just doesn't feel like it can possibly work out for anyone. Worse still, I don't see how DC can really fix things. What are they supposed to do now? Go back to the original DC universe that everyone still likes? What about the handful of things in the New 52 that are actually kind of good and worth keeping? They've done so much irreparable damage to their own history, I'm not sure they'll be able to quite cobble things together into one coherent narrative. And it's going to be all the more difficult to draw me back into the world the same way Marvel manages to time and time again. While over at Marvel Comics they have this sprawling and complex universe with real history, the distinguished competition is increasingly foreign to me, lacking this context. I'm sorry for the overly wrong rant or something that sounds overly negative, but it's been a long time coming. We should be in a golden age of comics thanks to the proliferation of these stories through Marvel's cinematic universe. More people are reading comics now than ever before, and while Marvel is embracing this in spite of some real flaws and the chagrin of many sensitive fans, DC feels like they are collapsing in on themselves in comparison, making the same mistakes all over again. I could be wrong, and I hope I am. I hope DC is preserving the best of their stories and working to the best of their abilities to bring us something great, but I strongly suspect there's more going on here. I know their usual approach to things, and I'm just not thrilled about it. But that's just my lousy opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.